beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of gray, purple mountains, majesty above the fruited plain.
Ladies and gentlemen, something is wrong in America. I want to say that the people listening to us, especially the young people listening to us, they've got to understand that we have not presented ourselves as brighter than they are because we are older. We are not presenting ourselves as Americans with higher IQs, greater levels of intelligence. We are just Americans who grew up in a time when the schools worked, and you understood what the obligation was as an administrator, as a teacher, as a student, as a parent. And we've got those bloody liberals to thank for taking away that basic core foundation, the stuff that made us strong.
Simon & Schuster Audio presents Pick a Better Country. An unassuming colored guy speaks his mind about America. Written and read by Ken Hamblin.
And crowned I good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea.
Pick a better country. I throw that challenge out to people almost every day on my radio show. A while back, I talked to a 29-year-old black trucker who was whining about how bad it is for a black guy out on the American highway. I stopped him cold when, in the midst of our dialogue, I said, "Pick a better country." "No way," he responded without the slightest hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere. You'd have to carry me out of here kicking and screaming." "Then why don't you get on board and become part of the very thing you refuse to give up?" I challenged him. He had no answer, because he's caught in a limbo. He's afraid to get on board as a fully vested American, driven by the promise embodied in the American dream. Why? Because boisterous African-American community activists are telling him America doesn't work for guys like him. How you? Two of the most powerful words in the English language. H-O-W-Y-O-U. You look a man, you look a woman in the eye, paint a broad smile on your face, extend your hand and say, "How you?" And you know what happens? They become neighborly. They don't have time to notice whether you're short or tall, fat or skinny, black or white. All they have time to do is extend their hand, the ice begins to break, and you hear, why, fine, how you? That's the kind of people Americans are, and that's the kind of nation America is. For the last couple of summers, I've been getting on my motorcycle, Wild Thing, firing up its 90 cubic inches of American iron, and like an old hound dog, I've gone sniffing across America. One year, on the way to Sturgis, South Dakota from Colorado, I stopped at a windswept gas station on a stretch of highway in Wyoming, so desolate there weren't even any overpasses for literally hundreds of miles. As I stood there filling up in my black fringed leather biker attire covered with road grit, a white man in a button-down salesman's attire approached me. He came straight at me, no smile, and I took a chance. "How you?" "I just want you to know how much I envy you," he blurted out. Sometimes you have to take that chance. And I'll admit, there have been times when it hasn't paid off. If it turns out that a person on the other end is having a problem with black people to the point that every black person is a nigger, well, that's not my problem. I refuse to become an emotional punching bag for those people. There are too many good, healthy people in the world for me to spend time devaluing myself because I've come into contact with one of the exceptions. And I do believe the majority of people all over the world are good folks. But I believe Americans are special because our culture is built on saying hi to the guy next to you. Americans are for the most part jovial. We're the kind of people who want to share our good fortune because that's what America is about, good fortune. Success and winning are part of our culture. That doesn't mean we don't have a grip on reality. It means that if you're a farmer and your cornfield is flooded because of an extended rain, the other farmers at the general store in town understand your problem and they feel sad for you. They understand that in America, if you work hard and you do something the way you're supposed to, you ought to win. But when it doesn't happen that way, they expect you to suck in your gut, go back to the bank, put your John Hancock on another loan, and forge on, knowing that your failure was just a fluke. Success is what America is supposed to be about. Opportunity and success. You know that, the bank knows that, and you work together to make a go of it. That's what my life has been all about, making a go of it, and it's paid off with adventure and success. I'm a West Indian boy, first-generation American, and I know a lot of fellow black people who miss the greater part of America because they're afraid to venture far from other black people and from their urban homelands. They're afraid of ghosts from the past. My message to them? Get over it. Seeing and experiencing America is worth the gamble. I'd be the first to admit that my path to the American dream has presented obstacles, sometimes because I was black and other times because obstacles are part of every man's road to success in America. Like a lot of New Yorkers, for instance, I couldn't figure out how to take the first big step out of town. To begin my expedition to see America, I had to get a bus ticket from Uncle Sam. When I was 17, I couldn't get a job. And I don't know whether it was because I was black or whether, like every young person starting out, I simply had no job skills. So I went down to the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Recruitment Center in Times Square intending to join the Air Force. As I was sitting there, waiting my turn, I couldn't keep my eyes off a large poster showing a man hanging under a parachute. A very astute Army sergeant noticed my curiosity and struck up a conversation. "That's airborne," he said. "The enlistment is 3 years instead of 4. It pays $50 more a month." Today, I'm an alumnus of the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army. I was sworn in on Whitehall Street in downtown Manhattan, then sent to Fort Dix, New Jersey, where I did my basic and advanced infantry training. After that, I was shipped out from McGuire Air Force Base to Fort Campbell, Kentucky for jump school. It was the first time I ever sat in an airplane. Here I was all signed up to go airborne, and I'd never even flown in an airplane before. The plane rumbled down the runway, rotated, got to flying altitude, and leveled off. I remember I looked down, assessed the size of the cars, and I said to myself, yes, I can do this. When we went off post at Fort Campbell for some fun, we went to Clarksville, Tennessee, or Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Now, this was about 1958. I was a first-generation American, born and reared in New York City. I'd never been exposed to the South, and very early in my tour of duty, this group of us, one other black soldier besides me, stopped at this restaurant in Clarksville to get something to eat. At least I had the presence of mind to be in uniform. The restaurant looked to me like any other eating establishment up north. We sat down, and customers came and went. The waitress seemed to know most of them. Occasionally, she glanced at us and then went about her business serving the others. Finally, I said to her, "Excuse me, I'd like a cheeseburger, please." She looked at me, wiped her hands with a towel as she moved toward the other end of the counter and said, "We don't serve no niggers." And I said, "Well, ma'am, I don't eat niggers. I just want a hamburger. My buddies got me out of there with rapid speed." I started spending a lot more time on the base. By the mid-1960s, I had had quite a few bad experiences with white people in the South, including more encounters while I was in the Army and still more when I went south with Brooklyn Corps to register Negro voters in Greensboro, North Carolina. But on one trip home to Brooklyn from Greensboro, I experienced the flip side of the coin. Around 1964-65, I was driving home from Greensboro, where I'd been visiting Cecil Butler, another good friend of mine from New York, who had become a full-time civil rights activist in North Carolina. It was wintertime, a cold, cold winter on the seacoast that year, and somewhere on the back roads of Virginia, or West Virginia, I don't remember which, I ran out of gas. The engine conked out just as I crested the top of the hill. At the bottom, as luck would have it, was a gas station. I coasted pretty much right up to the pump. A woman came out, a white woman. As I struggled to unfold my stiff limbs and get out of the car, she looked me over and said, "My God, boy, you look like you about froze to death." We got the car gassed up, and she said, "Well, come on in here, let's get you warmed up." I walked into the forerunner of today's convenience store. I remember there was this cherry red potbelly stove in there that stood about 4.5 feet tall. It was huge. I don't think you could have gotten your arms around it, and it was putting out heat like I couldn't believe. There were 2 white men in coveralls sitting by the stove. They looked like characters out of the Beverly Hillbillies. By now I was apprehensive. But they moved over, and I took that as an invitation to join them around the stove. They asked me where I was from, told me I'd better take off my shoes and warm up my feet. I carried that experience away in my soul. Up until that time, I didn't have a good feeling about me and white Southerners. And I'd been fighting hard in the South for civil rights for black people. But I knew in my heart that these folks didn't extend hospitality to me because a civil rights law had passed declaring that they had to be nice to Negroes. These people were representative of what's always been right with America and with most of the American people. Seeing America, living its adventures, and reveling in our successes in this great country are what makes us Americans. I'm just one of the roughly 70% of black Americans who, like the Irish, the Mexicans, and the Poles, went after and ultimately got a piece of the American dream. Along the way, my black friends were right beside me. Together, we were soldiers, we were entrepreneurs, we were adventurers, we were soulmates. My experiences and the experiences of my black friends over the last 4 or 5 decades have been like millions of other black people who fought for the chance to participate in America. I refuse to be considered exceptional for my accomplishments in America or to believe that the obstacles I've met along the way were particularly exceptional. As I say on the radio, I'm just an unassuming colored guy. Like a lot of Americans, though, I've come a long way. A trip through New York's predominantly black ghettos in the spring of 1991 chiseled a deep and profound resentment into my soul about the underclass today and its seemingly passive acceptance of an impoverished quarantine in that city. I'd been invited to guest host a weekend talk show on CNBC, and I used the occasion to visit Brooklyn. I hadn't been home in nearly a decade. As I motored through murky districts of New York, I marveled at the decay on Harlem's 125th Street, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, in Brownsville, all neighborhoods fallen far from the way they were during the period in American history when their black residents were proud to be greeted as Negroes. I've since considered that despite the obvious inequities of those days, in a way it was a glorious time for the people of my race, a time when we were determined to command dignity and respect, determined to fight with our every fiber to make the best lives for ourselves and for our children. We were seeking a simple but powerful status in America. We wanted to be given an equal opportunity and then to be judged according to our honest efforts. I studied the teeming sea of dark-skinned faces in those streets while I sat in the car waiting for the traffic light to change at the intersection of Flatbush Avenue and Fulton Street in Brooklyn, and I wondered who these people had become. What were the dreams of this motley assembly of street-corner vendors who looked like a multitude of excited ants busy peddling every conceivable black market knockoff from Rolex watches to Chanel No. 5 cologne? It was clearly a third-world scene. The trash-laden avenues looked more like roads in the heart of Port-au-Prince, Haiti, or a desolate barrio in Nicaragua than the streets I remembered in Brooklyn, New York. I wondered how my old neighborhood, symbolic to me and to my family as the promised land beyond a third-world Caribbean island, could possibly have regressed to this. I am convinced that at the core of this problem is a warped metamorphosis of the American welfare system, a new multifaceted welfare culture so pervasive that it has created a completely new paradigm for the poor, one which denies all the tenets and the hopes of the American dream. Life for me began the way it has for millions of little black boys in this world. I was born into terrible poverty in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant on October 22, 1940. I was the eldest of 5 children, all of us raised for the most part by women. My father, like my mother, an immigrant from the Caribbean island of Barbados, was a New York City cop. He left home after me and my brother were born, and my mother became dependent on welfare. As the firstborn, I was aware early in my life of the seemingly endless shortages that my mother suffered trying to care for me and my brothers and sisters. While I can't recall ever going to bed hungry, I can remember more than once that she divided the food on her own plate to provide seconds for my brothers and sisters when they complained they were still hungry. Like any child, I got my first signals from my mother that something was wrong. A sadness that was ever present in her eyes always seemed to dog her as she went about her never-ending quest for food, shelter, and a couple of extra dollars to play the numbers, her one crippling vice. It didn't take long for me to associate with her melancholy. Observing her suffering and her disappointments, I gathered that when you were poor, life was unstable and unpredictable, and I learned to be a bit distrustful of any occasional moments of bliss, always wondering what tragedy might be lurking right around the next corner. I also sensed from her that poverty made us different from other people, and so I hated welfare. I thought welfare was dirty, that it cheapened the soul. From my perspective, being on welfare meant we couldn't raise our voices or make any other noise when we played in the furnished rooms where we lived. It meant perpetually moving from one public school district to another. It meant regularly having to cower in silence behind a torrent of thunderous blows against the door from landlords and landladies demanding the rent. I learned that when you are poor, you must learn to be invisible. When I left home, I met people who seemed to be the masters of their domain. They stomped and made noise. Their very presence seemed to say, "I'm here." Not only could they make themselves known, but they assumed the right to demand exactly what they wanted. They could tell hotel clerks, "The room's not right," or tell waiters, "Please take this back, I ask for it rear." I realized that poverty would require me to sneak through life, saying little, and I didn't like that prospect. We got groceries almost daily at the neighborhood store owned by a Jewish man named Jack on the corner of Atlantic and Brooklyn Avenues. I remember him as always pleasant to his customers and respectful, even of my mother when she begged for additional credit despite the bills she hadn't paid. Nonetheless, our poverty was embarrassing to her. She never wanted anyone else to hear her pleading for credit, so we would go into the store and wait until it was empty. Jack would see her and let out a little sigh that I suspect only we observed. Jack stocked all kinds of items guaranteed to tantalize a kid. There was everything from big barrels of giant, juicy pickles to chocolate and hard rock penny candy displayed neatly in a case behind sparkling glass. But I learned that being poor meant you couldn't have the peppermint candy you salivated for. We didn't buy Wheaties and Cheerios at Jack's. We bought only the basics, and there were times when we couldn't even afford enough of them. The rice, the flour, the split peas, and the beans to feed the family.